Good afternoon, everyone, and happy lunch hour. We're absolutely thrilled to have you joining us as part of our next Professionalism Week presentation at OHSU with a really important discussion around well-being informed leadership. I'm Dr. Renee Edwards. I serve as the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Wellness Officer for OHSU. And as part of Professionalism Week, again, we're thrilled to have three speakers on this topic. Dr. Megan Furnari is an associate professor of pediatrics and serves as our associate chief wellness officer. Dr. Brian Park is an assistant professor of family medicine, is also the Relate Lab director, which I'm quite certain you'll hear more about as part of the presentation, and the medical director of the OHSU Health Equity Organization. And finally, Alexis Jaggers is the program manager for OHSU Wellbeing. You can see we have a really wonderful team to lead this discussion around well-being informed leadership. They're going to welcome your questions in the chat, although we'll probably accumulate most of those until the very end, except for one that they'll call out during the course of the presentation. So I'm going to turn this over next to Dr. Furnari. Again, thank you all for being here. I have to acknowledge I'm going to have to step out a little bit early for a conflict, but I look forward to the fact that we are taping this and all have also the opportunity, along with the rest of the organization, to look at it later. Dr. Furnari.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. It's an honor to be here for Professionalism Week and to be with my co-presenters, Dr. Park and Alexis Jaggers. I'm going to take us right in. This is a topic that we all feel really passionately about. And I'm just going to start by thinking with Dr. Park a little bit about professionalism. I put a dodecahedron on the slide. One, because I love the Phantom Toll Booth, if you read it as a child, and two, because I think professionalism has many different parts. And well-being is a part of professionalism. Leadership is a part of professionalism, and they're all intertwined. And the landscape that you are sitting in at work and the feeling you have in that space and all of these different components is constantly mixing. So I think this part of the conversation is just one of many, and I would love Dr. Park to also think with me on the dodecahedronness of professionalism to kind of set the tone for how this all fits.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Furnari. I don't think we ever connected on our shared love of the Phantom Toll Booth. It was like my favorite book growing up, so I'm totally tickled by this. But yeah, I think a lot about the contextuality of professionalism as well, of how professionalism might look different based on different cultures. I'm sure it'll look different based on different institutions, even social norms. And I know there was a really great piece in academic medicine, I think it was earlier this year, by someone whose name is Dr. Daniela Maristani down at UCSF, who did a study really thinking about what does professionalism look and feel like for example, trainees of color. And I think what they found was that, the social distance that one has to travel to uphold the professionalism standards might look different for those of us who have different cultural backgrounds, racial, ethnic backgrounds as well. So, this aspect that you're raising, Dr. Furnari, of there's so many different parts of professionalism, it might look and feel different based on the context, is really important. So I think just looking at straight on and really holding together, what does professionalism mean to us at our institution in this space is really important. So I really appreciate you raising this question for us all.
So we would be amiss as we start this presentation to say that the thoughts and opinions and curiosities that we all share come from just us, and that's part of our story, our origin story. So first we wanted to locate our talk within the professionalism dodecahedron, and next we wanted to name that we each come from a team and a group that talks a lot about various components to the dodecahedron, and leadership being fundamental in that, because that's, the relational piece of your day, the leadership piece, who's talking to you, coaching you, mentoring you, sponsoring you. And I wanted to first thank my team. I have Alexis here, who's incredibly important. She's going to be joining us in a little bit and is supporting us right now in this piece. And then Dr. Edwards is someone you already met. I also just wanted to point out Dr. I and Dr. Lenhart and Marissa, who allow us to develop these concepts of well-being informed leadership every moment, every day. So thank you, team, and OHSU Wellbeing. And I also wanted Brian to, Dr. Park, pardon, to honor his family at work.
Yeah, I love that Dr. Bernari suggested this. So yeah, I think of the many work families I have. First, clinically, I work over in family medicine here at OHSU. My clinical practice is at the Richmond Clinic, which is a community health center in Southeast Portland. And when I'm not doing clinical medicine, my work family is this group called the Relate Lab, where our true north is to create a more human-centered and equity-promoting healthcare system. And this photo here is one of the retreats that we did over the summer in my backyard. And we got to really strategize and dream about a lot of things together. And the work that we do is really about relational leadership development programs, community organizing with community-based organizations and research. And, I was really grateful to Dr. Fenari and Alexis for inviting me into this talk. I'm drawn to this work personally because of the ways that I've witnessed firsthand as a 7-year-old child of immigrants many years ago, the ways that really overburdened healthcare workers were perhaps ill-equipped to tend to the language needs, the cultural responsiveness that my parents really needed. My sister had a really severe chronic illness that she was diagnosed with at 3 years old. So we just had to interface with healthcare a lot. And now I stay drawn to this work because if I'm being honest, I think some of the most brilliant, creative, and good humans I've met in my life work right here at OHSU. And like all systems, I've also seen how just the busyness of our day-to-day lives, it can really get in the way of the well-being of these really brilliant, talented humans. And that's really what I love. I love helping people to figure out how do we center our relationships and values amidst a system that wasn't necessarily designed firsthand support us to do all that. So that's what brings me to this work here. And, if we go to the next slide, what Dr. Fernari and I wanted to start with is actually just a question to you all. We're here talking to you all about well-being informed leadership. So let's just take a step back to reflect on this. We want to just pose the question out to you all of who is a leader? How do you define a leader? Feel free to type it into the chat or come off of mute, whatever feels best to you. But we'd love to hear just a couple of thoughts from folks. No right or wrong answers here, by the way. This is not a test. It's just, how do we all think about a leader? There's many right answers. Great. Dr. Bumstead says, anyone who has influence. Absolutely. Alexis is someone who connects, inspires, supports a team. Perfect. What else? Maybe we can get one or two more thoughts in here. Great. Sequoia says, advocates for others. Yeah, so really this influence that we have on other people. This is great. Yeah. I think I'm just going to congeal together a lot of what people are sharing. I really like the definition from someone whose name is Marshall Gans of leadership. Marshall Gans was a community organizer, worked with change makers like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, to work on the rights of farm workers decades ago. And he said that leadership is taking responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. So taking responsibility, enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. And I really like that definition for two reasons. Number one, it says nothing about our formal titles. It says nothing about the letters and degrees after our names, the roles and responsibilities in our position descriptions, and it acknowledges that leaders are not just defined by our formal leadership roles, sometimes we call it like capital L leaders, and instead it acknowledges that we're all informal leaders, all of us, lowercase l leaders, right? That we're social creatures who are shaped and moved not just by our supervisors and our managers, but just as much by our peers and colleagues. And the second reason I like it is that, the definition says really little about performing defined tasks well, but rather it's about learning what tasks are needed for this team in this specific situation. So it's really defining leadership from the perspective, not from a knower, right? Someone who thinks that they know all the answers, but rather from the perspective of a learner, someone who's learned how do you ask the right questions to the right people in the right moments. So, I think a lot of what came through in the chat, how do we influence others under conditions of uncertainty, really resonate with me. So that's kind of the definition that we'll hold as we move forward in this talk. And I'll pass the mic back to Megan.
Thank you, Dr. Park. I think the reason we wanted to pause here is also, and that everything he said, along with, we want everyone to feel like they're a leader in their heart, because you are. That's how change happens, when everyone feels inspired to make things better, to grow, to connect with those around them, to raise everyone up. And formal and informal, it's really important we all feel that. And it's critical in organizations that everyone feels that. That's how we avoid burnout. That's how we create community and belonging. So that said, going into our talk, we wanted to name the objectives that we're going to cover in the next little bit here. First, we're going to share ways to foster team connectedness, some creative ways, some new ways, things you may not have thought about before. We're going to think about stress ripples. I love the imagery of rain on a lake and thinking about different people experiencing different things, but then also connecting. The layers of conflict and reflecting on how that may show up within you and within your teams and the people around you. Healing spaces and holding, something that came up a lot during the pandemic. How do we create spaces for spaciousness and for calm and for connection? And then how do we use values and purpose and sharing of those two things to create greater strength and courage within ourselves and each other?
Yeah, I think I'll take this slide. What Dr. Fernari and I want to do now is provide just a very high-level, digestible overview of maybe 7 or so key actions that we feel like all of us can take, formal leaders, informal leaders, to better foster well-being, better foster human-centeredness. And, I think we really picked these 7, not because we think that they're the end-all, be-all in any way, but, they're evidence-based, which is nice, and we have found in our day-to-day work that they tend to be overlooked at times, even though some of them seem simple or intuitive. And the first one might be that way too, which is to really try to acknowledge impact. I mentioned earlier that studies show that all of us, regardless of our roles, contribute to the well-being of our colleagues and our teammates. And with that said, studies also show that the behaviors of formal leaders seem to have the strongest associations with well-being and burnout on our teams. It's almost like we all have a voice. And when we're formal leaders, what we do and what we say, it's suddenly like we're talking from a megaphone or a loudspeaker. And so we find that this first action is often skipped, of acknowledging impact. And I think this step is often skipped because we often have greater control over our intentions, and it's not always apparent the impact that we might have on others. And even harder than that is that the impacts that external factors like current events in the world, personal lives, might be having on our teams and colleagues. And I think it's also hard because formal leaders have so many roles that we have to play, that of strategist, of manager, of financialist, as subject matter expert. But one that's often forgotten, a role that I think is really crucial for leaders is that of a witness. As leaders, we are inherently bearing witness to the lives of people on our team, their work lives. Sometimes we're humbly allowed into aspects of people's personal and socio-political lives. And, maybe this is really timely. I think we're living through this right now, a time when there's been immense violence, first in Israel and then Palestine and West Bank, and that has caused so many of us to feel intense grief and anger and heartache. And, more broadly, we're still living through times that we have seen the literature showing that the healthcare workforce is experiencing ongoing distress and burnout from the pandemic. So as leaders, I think right now we have to bear witness to the pain of our colleagues, the pain that's experienced in the shared human project that's simply being alive in the world right now. And as we list in the bottom in bold, in case you can't see it, it's often very challenging to know how to process these feelings. And the truth is, just to relieve people of this, we don't always have to know how to process these. Most of the time, we don't have to fix it, even though the impulse might be there. But I do think we have to stay open, we have to stay curious, we have to stay engaged with what's happening in the world, with what's happening in our teammates' lives, and consider if there's opportunities where we might create spaces where we can acknowledge the impacts of these factors on us as people, as individuals, and on our teammates as a collective. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Dr. Fernari, who's going to share a little bit about why it's so important to acknowledge impact so that we're not getting stuck in these stress and activation responses.
Thank you, Dr. Park. I alluded to this already. I think a lot about nature and imagery and everything nature has to teach us about its beautiful complexity. And as I reflect on stress in one's life and in the workplace, I think of a pond surface, as I said earlier, or a river, and the rain is falling down, and each of us is a raindrop, and we have an experience, and then there's all these pieces to it that emanate outward, and they could be emotional, they could be social, physical, cognitive, the personal experience. And they could be from the workplace, they could be from your home life, like Dr. Park, we're friends, mentioned on the last slide, and there's so much going on, and each of us brings that. And then in the team space, you have all of these little ripples overlapping or touching each other, right? As you try to do shared work, relational work. And suddenly there's energetics there. And I wanted to name those energetics can sometimes be opportunities, and we talk about that later. They also can be really hard. And as a leader, you're often standing amidst all these ripples with or without the support you need, with or without awareness of your process, and we'll talk about that later, and having to understand what to do. And so, the manifestation of the collective ripples is potential rifts. Erosion of trust is something we've seen very often inside and outside right now. And I feel like creativity also goes away when there's a really high stress response, and you can't dream and co-create in the same ways because there's a tension holding people back as they just try to survive. So I think an awareness of this in your landscape is the first thing. We talked about acknowledging, but then an awareness of where stress is landing within you and within your smaller microcosm of a team, and then even the macrocosm of the organization, and how you want to hold that. And I'm going to turn to Dr. Park for the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Fernari. I love the imagery that you're sharing with us of these ripples. And you're right, when we're trapped in our stress responses or fight or flight and our sympathetic nervous systems are activated, you're right, that's survival mode, it's not thrival mode. So it's really tapping us, getting us away from our creativity, from our innovation, our ability to make best sense of what's happening in our lives. And just to build on that point that you started, I think one of the biggest challenges of our modern day work lives is that all of us have been conditioned and socialized, whether we actively know it or not, to show up in a certain way, right? That we have to dress and act and speak and behave in certain ways to fit into our workplace. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, maybe the social distance of what's considered normal ways to dress or act or speak or behave is so much greater for some colleagues who may hold, for example, minoritized identities or people who may have different lived experiences than it is for others. And, to build on Dr. Fernari's point, when this happens, it's almost like we get trapped in our reptilian brains and we become hypervigilant. We constantly start scanning for how we have to perform to survive in a space, and it gives rise to what we sometimes call a performative self. And the evidence shows, though, that workplace engagement, workplace performance, they all improve when we each show up with more of our real and authentic self, where we feel like we aren't just surviving, but thriving. And so what we've done on this slide is we've tried to list a couple of micro actions that we feel like we might be able to take as leaders to support more of ourselves and each other's authentic selves, our inner humanity, to really emerge forth. Some of the things that we've really enjoyed doing, and I've seen Alexis, Dr. Fernari, others in this room do this, but the first is create intentional team spaces to check in on life. Gosh, I don't know that I've ever been to a meeting with Dr. Fernari that doesn't start with a check-in question of just how are people doing? What's something that's gone really well today? What's something hard that's happening in life? It's just a way for us to kind of self-editorialize. Gosh, if I seem a little absent today or my brain processing is a little slower, I just want you to know my kiddo's sick at home. So I just might not be as with it as I normally am. That way, Dr. Fernari knows that if we're on a team together. Like we mentioned earlier, maybe just being aware of and acknowledging if the moment feels right, the impact of local events, global events, and the impacts that they might have on our own emotions. I'm thinking about all the ways that teammates and colleagues have been impacted by the teacher strike of the Portland Public Schools right now and the impacts that that's had on colleagues. Of course, we've already mentioned the conflict in the Middle East as well. I think as leaders too, just sharing ways that we're tending to our own well-being needs too. I've sometimes done this as a team, the Relate Lab team will kind of check in with each other as what's something nice that you've done for yourself over the last week. Sometimes I'm like, I haven't done anything, so I'm going to do something today. But, I think we can model for one another. How are we taking care of ourselves so that we can build a community of care model for one another? Another thing that I've seen done really well is just model being comfortable with not knowing, model being comfortable with uncertainty and perceived mistakes. Someone that I really admire as a leader recently used the wording of, I'm just going to try something out here for the first time. I don't know how it's going to land, but I'm going to be a little bit bold. And I think it really gets at psychological safety, which is this notion of, is a team safe for intrapersonal risk-taking? And I think when a capital L or formal leader does a little bit of that interpersonal risk-taking publicly, it encourages the rest of us, oh, maybe this is a space that's safe for me to take a little bit of a risk as well. So just trying to find those moments where it might be safe to be a little bit more open, a little bit more real, maybe sharing something that you might think of as a perceived mistake or shortcoming, but it might help humanize yourself and others around you as well.
So part of being human is experiencing conflict. And this is Brian's quote, conflict can be the relationship trying to heal itself. And I love just being close with conflict. It's going to be part of life. It is part of life everywhere, internally, externally, all over the globe. And instead of seeing it as something you need to be reactive about and hypervigilant about, can it become something that you start to get curious about? That last comment Brian made about, I'm trying something out here. Invoking curiosity actually invokes your parasympathetic nervous system, which allows you to more effectively ground and talk to your team in a way that might feel calming and more open to productivity, or not productivity, but connection in the space, versus the reverse, where the conflict lives in you like a fire, and suddenly you're very, you're expressing all of the personal qualities maybe I had on that other slide outwardly, not just inwardly. And it's very hard for the team around that to know how to orient or operate sometimes. So thinking about conflict of not good or bad is something it's going to be in every day in some capacity. And how can you see it as opportunity? So I chose sedimentary rock as my image here, because it just has so many layers, and conflict has so many layers. As a leader, and as someone who's experiencing this in a team, a big L or little L leader, this is part of your life. And I think it's almost part of your history. That's why I chose the rock. Rock has lots of layers and histories that just keep accumulating on top of each other. So I put these questions to complement that idea. Who are you? Where does conflict land in you? Have you had old experiences or chapters that are still very alive? And what do you do with those? And as a leader, if you're a formal leader, I think getting really close to all of those chapters and really understanding them will allow one to be much more effective in the day-to-day, because you kind of know, oh, that layer is hard for me. That chapter is bringing something back to me right now. And is this part of the past or part of now? And it really matters for the people around you. Getting help. I mean, this all happens to each of us when something gets a little bigger and you realize it's not just the scenario, it's connected to more. Getting the support you need for leaders is essential, because often you're alone. I mean, if you think about how the formal structure often goes, the leaders at the top of organizations don't often have a lot of colleagues around that they can really talk to in a heartfelt way and get advice and share, because some of the things they're deciding and talking about are very confidential. So I think I just wanted to name that, because it's easy to forget sometimes that a leader might be operating in that kind of space. And how do we bring them to, in our own conversations, kindness and love? And when something doesn't go right, and realizing maybe they had good intentions and they didn't have the support or the tools they needed for success, and maybe we can be part of that growth. And then finally, just noticing, I think, self-awareness through this whole thing. When is it affecting you just internally, and when is it starting to go external and affect others? And how can you pause, notice that, and have a plan? And then always look around and see who's leading through conflict and who's thriving in conflict and growing in a good way and finding opportunities for new solutions and innovations and partnerships. And if that's my own bias shining through, how do I meet with folks like that and really understand them and how they work and how they connect in that space? Speaking of space.
Yeah, great transition. I love the quote that you just had of conflict as opportunity. That's beautiful. Yeah, and you just sharing about just the loneliness of leaders during the pandemic, it reminded me of, when the pandemic started in 2020, I personally felt lost at sea in terms of how to best support my team during this time of really intense and acute crisis. And I remember this article that we've cited here from the Harvard Business Review, HBR. It was shared with me by a really beloved mentor and colleague, and I found it to be one of the most applicable pieces I read on crisis leadership, and it just kept coming back to me. And the article talks about this concept of holding. I think it emerged from the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 2000s. And it's defined as the way of a person contains and interprets what's happening in times of uncertainty. What they mean by that is, how do we both acknowledge distress, which is containing, and make sure of whatever we can amidst chaotic times, like sense-making things, so that's interpreting, and just creating a space or a container where people can stick together to find a new way forward. So again, not having all the answers, but creating spaces where we can contain and interpret and sense-make what's happening. And I think this concept really resonated with me, holding, because, the truth is, as we think about it, only 10 to 20% of our work day to day has to do with concrete problems, right? Which have simple or task-oriented solutions. Like in healthcare, maybe that's who responds to a cardiac arrest, what do we do during a cardiac arrest? Which means that so much of our day-to-day work actually has to do not with concrete, simple problems, but really complex ones, which often have uncertain, emergent, process-oriented solutions. So we constantly have to think about, how do we bring diverse stakeholders together, put all of our best and worst ideas out there on the table, and start building consensus on what might work best in this specific context, in this specific moment. So I just really liked that, of really just this concept of, in hard times, what our role is as leaders is to just hold, and finding the ways that we can hold our colleagues. And some of the best practices for holding that they outlined in the article, some of these might feel intuitive. One is, as Dr. Ferraro was saying, clear and calm communication that we might be able to offer one another. Here's what I clearly know. Here's also clearly what we don't know and what we're trying to do to figure that piece out. Someone called it once to me, confident in not knowing. So we can be confident with one another if I don't know what that is. And, we're really trying to figure that out. Here's what we're doing. And I know that that's something we all want to figure out together. Use supportive nonverbals and caring words. It's really these things that humanize one another, provide empathy for one another during hard times, can go a long way. It helps tamp down the sympathetic nervous system for people. It really helps people to come back into their bodies and be able to integrate new information so they're not stuck in fight or flight. This came through in some of the other slides. Acknowledge your own feelings and acknowledge the team's feelings. It's okay as a leader, I think, for all of us to say, gosh, I'm really uncomfortable with this uncertainty, or I'm feeling a lot of anxiety about the fact that we don't really know what lies ahead in the next few months. But I think it's just it's almost like a balloon, right? Once you kind of touch it, all the air can come out. And I think that's true with emotions sometimes too. The moment you name an emotion, it's not as big and scary. And the last one is we can reduce uncertainty by listening carefully and being present. So really that generous listening, active listening that we can offer one another to tell people, I'm really listening and integrating the information that you're offering here as well. So I'll pass it to Dr. Fenari, who's going to talk a little bit about multiple truths and kind of both and thinking as well.
Yeah, this really is also just an extension of some of the themes from the prior slides, but understanding that, I think in healthcare, sometimes we try to be really black and white with solutions, and life is never black and white, and leadership's never black and white. Being a team member, being in an organization, being in a family, as we all know, there's so much gray. And I think with this slide, we're just naming the number of truths in the space. And it goes with the slide and the raindrops in the pond. Like every single raindrop, every single person's having a different lived experience that we'll never completely understand. And with that experience comes a truth, right? Your truth. And then you put us all in the work environment and something happens, but everyone's going to react slightly different based on their own orientation and lived life experiences. And as a leader, or just as a person in the space, realizing that. And I think it kind of it definitely presses a pause button on the judgment emotion and allows one to hold more than one truth and understand that everyone is going to have something. And honestly, that's kind of a beautiful thing, because when you can really listen in that space, you're going to learn a lot about the dodecahedron, again, the complexities of these issues. And to circle back to conflict, are there ways to just name that and say, I mean, a lot of this presentation is about acknowledging certain things in the room that often go unacknowledged and thus really prevent all individuals from really showing up. And I think one of our goals that we didn't put in that slide is there a way to start acknowledging spoken and unspoken things that need to be said, but often are neglected, to empower and provide support for your team in a really essential way, and for your peers and your colleagues. And this is a time where no one is, it's so hard to be rocking it every day because there's something rocking us every day. And I think any way we can create holding, connection, community, at work, we're giving something back that's really important, and doing that with respect and authenticity and multiple truths. And I guess flipping that again, if you're looking towards the formal big L leader at the organization, they too are probably holding thousands of truths, right? And again, they can't always tell you what they are because of confidentiality, and they tell you as much as they can with respect for all of the parties and the stakeholders in the space. And I always try to remind myself about that as well.
Awesome. And Dr., have the slides changed for you? For some reason, for me, it's stuck on the holding space, but it might just be my screen, because I think I heard you advance the slides.
I'm seeing shared values.
Cool.
Alexis, are you seeing shared values?
I'm seeing holding space also.
Very interesting.
Yeah, because I can
Maybe our tech support person can help with that.
Or we can maybe stop sharing and reshare.
Yeah, I would do that. Try to stop sharing and reshare again.
Thank you, Christopher.
Okay. Brian, do you want to talk about shared values while I'm doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends a little bit on the image that I created. So we'll see if we can get that back up. Sometimes the old turn it off and back on helps. There we go. Perfect. I'm seeing using shared values. Thank you, Dr. Fenari. Yeah, the reason that I wanted this image up is that, as I think about roles where I've been a leader, I would say 9 times out of 10, I can get trapped into thinking of systems change and leadership in this way, that if we improve the quality of our actions, it's going to lead to an improvement in our impacts and improve our outcomes. And, I'll just ask the rhetorical question of, how many of us have sat in on strategic planning sessions or workflow committees or quality improvement projects that have been hyper-focused on changing what we do, right? It's our tendency to take a technocratic approach to change. And if you go to the next slide, just a little bit of a different way of thinking about our work and change making and leadership, which is that, this is the work of Dr. Tony Suckman, who's a physician and organizational development expert, who says that, in a way, systems are nothing more than a series of conversations, and that the quality of our relationships on the right-hand side directly influences the quality of our conversations in that system, and that our system is a result of the conversations we have, or maybe just as importantly, that we don't have. And I think this is almost a different way. It's not a technocratic approach to our work, but a relational approach to our work. So from this frame, the quality of relationships improves the quality of our conversations, which then improves the quality of our actions. And that actually improves the quality of our impacts as a system. And it's a self-perpetuating cycle, right? When we see that there's positive impacts, positive change being made, it feels good, our relationships get better, our conversations enhance, there's more trust and collaboration. And this is really the work of Dr. Daniel Kim, who created the cause-impact theory, that these factors are all really interconnected. So it's all about understanding individual values and finding those moments where we can identify shared values through the quality of our relationships and the quality of conversation. So spending a lot of time on the right-hand side, or less so on the left-hand side, like I sometimes tend to do. If we go to the next slide, just a couple of things that one might try is really taking some time to reflect on the questions that we see on the screen here, which is, what are the core values with which you choose to lead? How can those values guide you? So really doing an exercise of really thinking about, what are my core values? What are the values that I really want to imbue and share with the team and live out in the world? And how can those values guide how I lead or how I show up on a team? And then, I think this is where the quality of conversations and the quality of relationships comes in. Can I spend some time trying to understand, what are my team members' core values? Why is it that Dr. Furnari is really passionate about the well-being and sustainability of the human workforce in healthcare? Why is Alexis so passionate about the well-being of and human sustainability of our healthcare workforce? And really understanding that happens through conversations. And then, are there overlaps there where we can start building a shared vision? Gosh, I care a lot about those things too. Human sustainability, relationships. Dr. Furnari and Alexis do too. I know that through conversations with them. And so can we build a shared vision of what the world can look like, what our institution can look like? And then, are there opportunities to foster increased team connection around those shared values? Can we work on something together? Can we have more conversations with other people about those shared values that we have? So just a couple of reflection items for you all to ponder and sit with. And I'll pass it back to Dr. Furnari.
Thank you. I also wanted to say, if you are wondering how to find language around values and you don't know where to start, I always Google Brene Brown, and she has a great PDF just with a long list of values, and it just gives you a starting point. And sometimes if you're going to have that conversation, it's nice to say, hey, why don't you take a look at this list and just circle a few that really stand out for you. Because sometimes values takes the brain in like all different places and spaces in your being, and it's hard to focus. So if you're a leader who would love to do this with your team, or if you're a team member who would love to do this with your team and your leader, I think bringing that document, saying, at our next team meeting, I just like to take a step back and maybe think about values together. It really works for me. It can be a beautiful opportunity. You can make word clouds out of these to further kind of emphasize the connectivity of the people, the overlap of the values, and how you really can work together and prioritize those in the day-to-day. Take us to the final slide, and then I'm really eager to hear what people have questions or thoughts on. And Alexis will be joining us there. So for additional support, circling back to our work families of origin here, we have OHSU Wellbeing offers the Wellness Consult service for leaders and teams with Dr. Sydney I. It's a great way to connect with our team and see if we can meet you and where you're at and supply some of those tools, strategies, and needs. Much of this presentation was built by Dr. I and Alexis, and we've adapted it with a little bit more of a leadership spin for today, obviously. And then, Brian, if you want to comment on the bullet about your family there, I'd love for you to say something because it's an amazing opportunity for the community.
Of course, yeah, and I just put in the chat, I've had the pleasure and honor of being able to sit in on some of the wellness consults for leaders and teams with Dr. I, and it's just very powerful. I think there's always such immense insights that are highly contextual to each leader and team that's come out. So just, it's one of those things that if you're thinking about it, I would strongly encourage people to pursue it because it's really, really powerful. The Relational Leadership Institute is a 2 to 3 month interprofessional, cross-generational leadership development program that's really looking at a lot of the best evidence-based practices for human-centered, relationship-oriented leadership. We've found, we've been around since 2017. I think over 300 folks from OHSU have taken it. And one of the most surprising things from a well-being perspective is that we've seen pre to post cohort that people's well-being indexes well-being scores improve statistically significantly from pre to post. And they seem to stay that way up to 6 months post-program. We didn't look beyond 6 months, but something about taking the program, it seems to enhance people's well-being and tends to be pretty sticky. So we've had the honor of being able to expand to other places like the University of Utah and University of North Carolina. We really love doing that work. So glad to answer any more questions. The website's listed there as well.
And there is another cohort coming, right, Brian, in the spring, or yes?
That's right. Yeah, spring 2024.
I'd like to join. Okay.
You got it.
Awesome. Couple other places to look or learn from. I put a peer leader you respect, or even a colleague, or even someone you see on a Zoom meeting or a WebEx meeting, and you're like, I just want to know more about their journey and what they have done in their career and how they lead or how they impact others. I just think it would be, I just encourage people in this time, in this day and age, reaching out, having a coffee with someone from a different mission or a different part of OHSU can be such a rewarding thing. I just did it this week, and I was reminded of the importance of in-person connection and just getting out of your usual day-to-day and building more relational bridges across the organization. Another resource from my team, OHSU Wellbeing, has a website on O2 under safety and support with all the different program offerings that we host, and then all of our partner programs and the people involved. I highly recommend you become friends with that website. It does centralize everything, and it is kept up to date. And then finally, your own leader, I think, and think about what you might say. I learned this from Dr. Nikki Steckler, who I think is the person Brian or Dr. Park was mentioning on the holding article. She's impacted and mentored so many of us in the leadership space. And in Paths to Leadership program she runs, she talks about when you do go talk to your own leader or somebody who's, a manager, a boss, whoever that person is, think about how you might want to approach the conversation, thinking that many people go to leaders with asks, needing things from them. And whichever role you're in today's workshop, thinking about if you're approaching a leader, how could you maybe create space for humanity and for holding and for connection in that moment? What would be interesting to ask in that, in that kind of a tone or in that energy space, instead of, adding to the list of things that people maybe want from them, and maybe more understanding them as a human being. To go back to Brian's point, finding that relational piece first and foremost. So we're going to pause here. That is our workshop didactic, so to speak. And we wanted to make room for questions, comments, inspirations from you, the audience, in the chat. And we're open to anything. And Alexis is joining us for this part and adding her rich perspectives on a long career at OHSU, with lots of great learning and knowledge as well. And thank you all. I know it's beautiful to come and join even virtually. I can't see the chat. Are there any questions that we have?
Not yet. Maybe while people are thinking, I'll share a reflection, which I'm hearing across so many spaces at OHSU about people who feel like they can't engage in social connection on WebEx meetings because it's the meeting zone and it's for professional work, right? And I think about that in the sense of professionalism and how we're thinking about professionalism and what our expectations are of teams and what leaders' message as important in the workplace, and how much we need our leaders at OHSU to help create space for social connection amongst teams and team building activities, and the relevance and importance of that and us being able to do our jobs well. and how the experience of all the things that have changed over COVID is really shining a light on some of the new expectations of what it is to be a good leader and what it is to be professional, that we need to make space for these human connections and relationality and work in order to have a successful workplace in those connections. So that's kind of a silver lining from having been through the pandemic, and also an opportunity, I really think, for OHSU leaders to be elevating how important that is.
I think there are a lot of thoughts around that set of really brilliant remarks, Alexis, because in healthcare, and Brian and I, let's just go with first names for now. Is this the casual part? Great.
Yeah.
Brian and I reflect a lot about, I use the word productivity by accident in the talk, because a lot of healthcare requires a lot of output, and that's kind of the message that's put forward. And yet it's healthcare. It's about healing. It's about humans, and that's the central piece as well. So there's these conflicting tensions in the space, and it's not just in the hospital, but I think it's all over. There's this, there's often a scarcity of resources, and people feel the need to keep going fast. And we're advocating in this talk to slow down, almost slow down to go fast. And not that we're saying productivity is the go fast. I think the go fast is, I know my team so well. I know, just when I look at Alexis in the morning and she looks at me, if it's going to be a day where we can get a lot done together, or we need to kind of lean on each other, or one of us needs to step back so the other can step forward. And I think that's what we're talking about. I mean, it's not this like, I want to find the middle ground here. I think it's this understanding of each other, a deep, compassionate connection, and understanding how to work in that space and really optimize strengths and the day-to-day, and like an awareness of the capacity of emotions and abilities. Brian, we talk about this quite a bit, so I'm curious, reactions, thoughts on adding that to the frame?
Yeah. Oh, so many thoughts. I mean, one of them actually is, it's interesting. I think we're all talking about what are some of the lessons from the pandemic. And I know one of the things that's being talked a lot about in community-based organizations, especially those that are culturally specific, are these ideas of community resilience hubs. And the idea is, I think we can all think of in the pandemic how maybe a lot of us were in kind of reactive mode of this crisis has fallen into our laps in our lives. And we're kind of scrambling to build the relationships as the crisis is happening of, oh, like you and I need to work together to get, testing kits out in the community, or, oh, we have to figure out how we're going to do vaccination sites in the community. And the idea of community resilience hubs is, what would it feel like if we were not reactive but proactive about our relationships? What if we spent the time building those relationships now, not to say, oh gosh, we're going to do this in case crisis happens, but saying like, oh, it's going to be so much easier for us to support one another in these easy times. And if a crisis does hit, that trust and relationship is already there for us to draw upon. We know exactly what I can offer, what you can offer, how we can work together, how we tend to work together. And I think a lot about that for healthcare too. I know our day-to-day lives are so busy, but I think building up those relational networks for us is investing in the busy future, the hard future, the crises that might be awaiting us around the corner. And in the meantime, those relationships are things we can draw upon now. Oh gosh, I didn't know that you had this interest. I do too. Or I didn't know that this resource was available. That makes me think of this other project that I actually didn't come to this meeting with. So really thinking about, Peter Block has this great quote of, community is the fundamental unit of change. So are we constantly trying to build that fundamental unit of change of community with one another? Because we'll never know when we might have to tap into them. And of course, our day-to-day team, whether that's clinical or research or educational, that's probably going to be the community that you'll draw upon the most. So really investing and doubling down on that team, I think, is what I've seen the best leaders and most effective teams do well.
I hope our participants will put questions in the chat or come off mute. Oh, yes, Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo Jeremy Cook, nursing director in patient acute care. I want to echo sort of what we are talking about here. And I was just speaking about this to someone a day or two ago about team building and sort of how we've lost that. And I think it's been an organic process that happened during COVID. And I think a lot of us retreated, right? We sort of pulled back, and it was this, I think, thinking back on it, I think it was almost sort of this mode of self-preservation. I need to figure this out. I'm back to my family. I'm back to the core, right? And then so now it's gotten to the point where, you know, interviewing and talking to folks, it almost feels like everything is one more thing, right? And so you talk about, let's do this. Let's go out for the arcade. Let's all have a beer. Let's do whatever that may be, right? In that team building. And it feels like, ooh, I just don't know if I can. It's one more thing. But I completely agree with you, Brian. I think it's one of those things where we need to double down. We need to really help move our teams in this direction to say, it's okay. I know the pool might feel a little cold or it looks cold, but we're just going to have to jump in. And I think we're going to learn a lot from each other and about ourselves to kind of get back into this mode again. But it's going to be a bit uncomfortable. This took us 3 years to get here. And I think that it's really going to be that investment that's going to take a few more years to sort of find our way out of it. But 100% on agree. I think from a leadership standpoint, that's where I would love to see us go back into that direction again and to invest in it.
I love that share, Jeremy. I want to just add quickly that I was in a meeting this morning with an interdisciplinary group of people talking about connection and belonging in the workplace. And there were two amazing quotes. One was that there was a nurse manager talking about how workload sometimes gets in the way of her making space for social connection with teammates. And she said, every time I make space for it, it's always so worth it. And another member of this group said, my sense of belonging in the workday directly impacts how resilient and capable I feel at work. Directly, like there's a direct connection between that sense of belonging and connection in the workplace and her ability to be resilient and get through the day's problems. And I just thought those two shares were so on point and speak so much to these qualities of leadership and things we can all do at any level to contribute to that culture of well-being.
That was eloquent, both of you. Something I heard too in Jeremy's share is there's going to be this transitional period. Like we've almost become deconditioned in the going within and internal into the home unit to come back out. Think of like a hermit crab when it just goes like, no, please don't touch me, and goes right into its shell. And this, you know, I think there was a lot that changed in communications when everything was so virtual. Here we are, but still, like, I think relational spaces shifted, words were shared, and there's also there's some harm in that, you know. I think people filled in narratives that weren't true about people, is my guess, and certain relationships really suffered and struggled, and people struggled. So I think as we go back into this more, I'd say, extroverted or relational space where we're a little bit more out in the world and in our teams, and just recognizing that too as a leader, as a team member, maybe there's room for some grace and some forgiveness. Thinking about what happened in your own spaces, I know I'm reflecting and thinking right now in this moment, like, who could I circle back with and say, you know what, we got off maybe on the wrong foot, or we had a moment or a chapter that was really tricky, and I wonder if we could come together now and find connection again, or find connection for the first time, because some people have never met in person, they're meeting in person now. It's just so unusual. And so just holding all that with grace and trying to work towards something that feels more connected is what I heard you say, Jeremy, and you too, Alexis, so that we can all be our best selves, or the best selves we can be in that moment.
Yeah, and just to triple click on what others have shared, I really just loved what Jeremy shared, and it reminds me of the old adage of like going slow to go fast, you know, when we double down on relationships. And, you know, the other thing I've been working on and thinking about as a leader is I never want to be zero sum in my thinking that if we add something, we have to take it away. And I am hearing that from a lot of people I work with of, oh, it just feels like one more thing. It's hard to think about one more thing, whether it's task oriented or relationship oriented, just because priorities have shifted for people. And I think there's different cultural norms because the pandemic, as Jeremy so thoughtfully outlined. And as a result, something I'm trying as a leader is what are the little things I might be able to take away? Can we actually not talk about this as an agenda item so that we can talk about checking in with one another, or so that we can check in on life or family life? Or, oh, is there something on the team agenda that we actually might not have to talk about, so that there's more space for all of us as a team to check in on what's workloads looking like? So, I think even as our team composition and our team values are shifting, I think as leaders, we kind of have to respond to of just assessing, are there things that can maybe, if we're asking folks to double down in relationships, of is there something small that maybe stands against relationships that we can help take away or slow down, or hit the snooze button on for a later time? So something that I'm trying out just in this new environment that we all find ourselves in as leaders.
I wanted to add one more thing on that. It just keeps bringing up new thoughts. I feel like I'm a recovering ICU doctor. I'm now just in the nursery, right? So I've stepped down in acuity, and it's kind of this amazing metaphor for, life. How do we, as leaders, as people and teams, think about what's actually needing to happen today, and what have I told myself historically needs to happen today, and is it all equaling the right things? Because I think sometimes we think of everything in urgent in these spaces that we're in, and it's maybe not the case, and maybe our own sense of urgency is impacting everyone around us in a way that isn't helping. And maybe those things don't have to happen today. They can actually happen a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow and the next day, and still create this amazing outcome. And I think that's something I've tried to re-triage my need to try and get everything done really quickly. And I still want to have quality outputs and reasonable expectations for myself and others in the space. But I think there's a new way to think about that, that's more human-centered and more intentional. And a direct challenge to the historic medical culture, right? So, and certain things have to be emergencies with patient care. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying maybe think about everything else for your own health.
That's why I think it's so important to encourage folks to incorporate opportunities for brief social connection and team building within existing meeting structures, right? Carve out the time, make it happen. It can be, it can take just a few minutes, and if you do it routinely, the results can be so powerful.
Does Jeremy have another question or thought? I see him in his screen. Oh, he's just joining us. Thank you. Okay.
Nice to see faces.
Appreciate that. Great. Well, it is. Oh, hey. Does Abby have a question?
Well, I just wanted to comment. I was typing that in. I was like, maybe it would just be easier to come off mute and share. But I'm Abby. I'm the SPL 4A and 14A. But I really like what you guys are saying about really to look at what needs to be done for the day, because I think that especially as leaders using emails and Teams and then wanting to go connect with our team if we're in a clinical space out there, it's really hard to prioritize or know, because I think as soon as, maybe me being a newer leader, as soon as I get a Teams message, I'm like, oh, this is urgent, I need to respond to that, or same with an email. And so I think just kind of having that in the forefront of like when we start our day, and maybe give that as an intention for the day of not everything that I get bombarding me needs to happen at this time, so we can kind of prioritize how we want to spend our time. So I really liked that, and that meant a lot to me. Thank you.
In the fleeting moments for you, Abby, the Eisenhower rubric comes to mind. Former Dean Sharon Anderson brought it into my life. It just helps you kind of triage a little more effectively on what you should move to that urgent pile and what you shouldn't. It's one of those many matrices, and take it or leave it, but I thought she made a good point when she brought it to me in my life, so hope that helps. All right, it's top of the hour. Do we close ourselves? I guess we do. I wanted to thank Dr. Park and Alexis Jaggers, Dr. Edwards for introducing us, for the entire group that organized Professionalism Week. It's been a real pleasure to be a part of this, and I hope we can continue to have these conversations. Please reach out to any one of us. We love talking about this topic, and we want to support the organization and all of you. And thank you for everything you do here at OHSU and your contributions. It's very meaningful to us and to many. Have a great rest of your Thursday.